Hello and welcome to National Library Singapore's signature program for conversations. My name is Ashif from the National Library's engagement team. There's always something to discover at the library where we seek to ignite passion for learning through our collections, services, and programs. And for conversations is where we bring together thought leaders to share new possibilities for the future, inspire lifelong learning, and the creation of new knowledge based on the theme New Thinking for a New World. And over the past 3 conversations, our local and international speakers discussed the changes in the future of work, our well-being, and the art scene. To kick off the 4th conversation on development of urban design, we have Ms. Tracey Hwang, who will be moderating the session. Tracey is the Director of Urban Design at the Urban Redevelopment Authority in Singapore. And as part of today's conversation, we have specially put together a resource guide that you can refer to if you would like to learn more about this topic. You can access it through the QR code and the link that we'll be putting up later.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Ashi, for the introduction. Good evening. Welcome to today's panel discussion on the development of urban design. This title actually sounds very broad, but today we're mainly focusing on how urban design for public spaces can be reinvented with the pandemic as a backdrop and how it will affect the community. I'm happy and honored to be able to share this online platform with Silvia and Chintan. I should give a brief introduction first. Silvia is a lecturer and researcher from the University of the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia. And Chintan is cities planning and design leader from Arab Southeast Asia. So maybe before we start the discussion proper, we invite Silvia and Chintan to just give a brief introduction of themselves. Say something that's not in your CV, maybe. Silvia,
okay.
Would you like to go first?
Yeah, okay, sorry. Thank you. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you for the invitation and for the introduction. So the boring stuff first, that is in my CV, but it's all very exciting. So I am an urban designer and architect from Brazil. So I'm an architect, registered architect in Brazil. Here in Australia, I work with urban design and urban planning. I'm a lecturer and researcher, as Tracey said, in the University of the Sunshine Coast. I have been in New Zealand for 6 years before I moved to Australia. I worked there in an environment post-earthquake. When the earthquake happened in Christchurch in 2011, I had just arrived there. So I spent 6 years in New Zealand and then a brief time in Germany doing some research. And then I moved to Australia 3 years ago. I've been here for 3.5 years. So I'm an expert in moving. That's probably something that's not on my CV. I'm an expert on moving when disasters happen. So I arrived in New Zealand and the earthquake happened, and then I arrived in the Sunshine Coast and COVID happened. So yeah, so that's the way I learn about cities is always in strange environments and all new for us. The core of my research is urban climate. So that's where I focus my research is on how we can design to improve urban heat islands and to sort of mitigate urban heat islands and the not so good effect, like adverse effects of heat waves and for health and all that. So yeah, I guess that's me for now. And one other thing that I do is that I am an amateur urban web designer. So that's another thing that I do that's not on my CV.
All right. Hi. Thanks, Tracey, for the introduction. Yes, I'm Chintan, and I am an urban designer and architect as well. And I lead the cities team here, but I'm also part of the Future Cities Hub, which is part of Arab, and where we look at, it's supported by EDB, where we look at anything to do with future cities in Southeast Asia, in the whole of Southeast Asia. So it's been a very interesting aspect to look at various cities of where they are in Southeast Asia at different points in time and different issues that they have. And that's, of course, very different, right, from Singapore to Jakarta to the new capital city of Indonesia, which we are planning, or KL or Thailand, etc. So I think that makes my life really exciting. So I look at designing brand new cities, as I mentioned, indoor capital, down to precinct designs, down to walkability, etc. So that's my day-to-day job. Actually, connected to that, something that's not in my CV is that I am an avid biker. So I've been cycling almost all my life, and in cities where there were no. So before this, I was in the UK and I was in London, and I started cycling when there were no bike lanes, and the bus guys didn't know how to manage cyclists, and now there are bike lanes there. Same thing happened in Singapore, where 5.5 years back I started cycling in Singapore, and their bus guys didn't know how to manage cyclists, and taxi drivers didn't know that they have a side mirror and they can hit you whenever you want. So that's changed dramatically, and Singapore has become much safer for us cyclists. So yeah, there you go. That's me.
Thank you, Silvia, and thank you, Chintan. Okay, so today what we are going to discuss is probably one of the most talked about topics in the midst of this coronavirus. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed our day-to-day life in almost every city in the world. Changes that transform the way we think, design, and live in cities. There's 4 cities around the world to come up with response measures to meet the needs of this changing environment. So today we shall hear from our guest panelists on their take on how the current crisis has or will bring about changes to our urban landscape and urban design, in particular on the access to and use of public spaces, and answer some of the emergent questions at the interface of COVID-19 and city design. So there are two sections to this discussion. The first section of the discussion, I'll invite our panelists to share broadly the challenges and opportunities that this present climate has brought about in the urban development of cities they have worked or resided in, how COVID-19 has affected the place we work, live, and play. They're both very well traveled, so I'm sure they have a lot to share. Yeah. And for the second section, we can dive deeper into how future cities can be or should be designed with a focus on the public realm. So to begin, may I just invite Chintan and Silvia to share with us your experience in studying the challenges and opportunities the coronavirus crisis has brought about to the cities. How have these changes or these challenges, brought about changes in the urban fabric? Yeah, will Silvia like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the first thing I should share is that I have been doing some research in this area and trying to analyze and explore what are the changes in the functionality of public space that have come about with sort of some functions that cease to exist or be available to people because of the lockdown and because of this inaccessibility of some of these public spaces. So yeah, there are some things that we are seeing in terms of how different public spaces and even semi-public spaces sort of access areas or points of access between fully public and private spaces in terms of using some tactical urbanism or some sort of like more temporary uses that we can use, we can explore to pilot how these changes could happen in the longer term. So that's one thing we have been seeing quite a lot. And yeah, I think here in Australia, we were fortunate, at least where I am in Queensland, that we haven't had a full lockdown. So we have always had access to public spaces. And I think one key thing is that we have realized that in situations like this, we have a lot of public spaces, we can go to public spaces, but then we realized some aspects of design that could have been, if we had a pandemic like this in the books when we had to plan, then we would probably have planned different, like, how wide the footpaths are and how much we can enjoy the public space in a way that we are together, but we are not necessarily engaging with each other. So yeah, I think there are quite a few things that we have already experienced here because of the fact that we didn't have a full lockdown. So we could experience them.
That's really interesting in what's happening in Australia. I think for us, and when I say us, I think for us living in Singapore, I think it's been a really, really different experience. It basically has turned the density of activities in the city completely upside down. In the daytime, you would have that density, activity, and vibrancy in the CBD area, the city center area, or all the areas where people go to work. And there would be less activity in places where we live. And that has completely changed. Suddenly you have more energy and more space and more people, etc., in the residential areas and less in the city areas. I recently went close to where I work, and I've seen every alternate shop currently, or restaurant or a cafe closed. Hopefully it's temporary and it'll open soon. But the restaurant, but the cafe next to my home, thriving. So the way it is, even the logistics, the waste pickup trucks are more often coming to the residential areas. The logistics, the Lazadas or the Amazons are more and more coming home rather than going to the office. So in terms of us city designers, the way the water consumption, the energy consumption, everything has completely just turned around. And that has become really interesting because the peaks have changed for the city design, for us planners to think about how, or designers to think about how every plot has to be thought about in the future. We've been told that the recent survey says that most of the employees say that they're never going to go back to the office full time. 40% of my time I'm going to work from home, which is 2 days a week. What does that mean for the CBD? What does that mean for the residential areas? What does that mean for every kind of movement pattern that transport planners design? So I think that's basically has been a really, really interesting challenge, but a fantastic opportunity to think about how we think about a future of our cities where things are a lot more homogeneous rather than everything focused in one place.
Yeah, thank you both. But I guess I'm from URA. I do have to respond to Chintan's comments. Yeah, so in URA we have recognized that we need to not put everything in the CBD. So we have been decentralizing our commercial users, our commercial functions, and that probably may be the way forward, so that people don't really have to all travel to the CBD. They can work near their homes. So that's one move that we have done. That also ease up the congestion going into the city every morning. Yeah. So, okay. Thank you very much for your response.
So could I add one more point to that, Tracey,
yeah,
actually?
Sure.
You know, when we right now talk about live, work, and play, and I think we need to really start deeply thinking about, here's probably I'm putting some kind of a spice in the conversation, is that we got to really seriously start thinking about live, and we also talk about live, work, play, learn. But I think we need to really add make in this conversation. What is the future of making in the cities? What's the future of manufacturing? We talk about, URA talks about as well. There's very high-end manufacturing coming, future industry 4.0, etc. So if we really want to diversify the way people think in terms of employment, so beyond just our kind of jobs which is on desk, what happens to our city spaces where you actually can also introduce manufacturing within that, beyond just residential?
I think one interesting point as well is that, you know, talking about urban fabric, as you asked, Tracey, urban fabric here in the Sunshine Coast where I am is very different from Singapore. It's much more spread out and lower density. But one thing that we noticed and is quite clear is that people weren't, because of this need for motorized mobility, you know, and the individual cars largely, here is very, very much based on cars. We have noticed that this big difference, and people are working from home, they are going to their local cafes, as Chintan was saying, and they are just discovering their neighborhoods. You know, we see people actually stopping and looking and saying, I've never noticed this house in the corner, because we are not actually used to look around, because of the speed of the car is a different speed to the pedestrian, right? So if you live in a neighborhood or in a city that is largely based on mobility by cars, the cities are naturally designed for that. Like that is their briefing, right? Like we need to design for the car. So we are not used to actually look around the neighborhoods the same way that we have been now that we have been locked in this sort of like boundary. It's not locked in at home, but it's sort of, there's a clear boundary of not going so far. So yeah, that's an interesting thing that we have noticed here as well.
Yeah, so I guess because of the density difference, our neighborhood, we still need to check before we cross the road. It is still, the traffic is still rather high. Yeah, but it's an important point that now that everything it's that everybody stays or move within the neighborhood. That there's really scope to enhance the amenities, the provision, the facilities within the neighborhood, so that people don't really have to travel out. And yeah, and that during this pandemic situation. And also to the point, I wanted to add to the point that even in our CBD, our new extension in Marina Bay, we do recognize that, you know, in the old CBD, shops are really closed during the circuit breaker or the lockdown version, Singapore's lockdown version, and it's really dead. So we do recognize that there needs to be this 24/7 kind of buzz and activity. So in our new extension, which is at the Marina Bay, we have put in many other uses like a residential, and we'll continue to build on this mixed use typology so that we have a vibrant CBD. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Let's see. Okay, shall we then move on? We can take a break here and bring on the first poll question. So the participants, you would like to do a vote? Okay, while waiting for the responses, maybe I can ask Silvia and Chintan, what is your own personal experience or encounter in the use of public space during this period in your neighborhood? Do you feel, you know, there is a restriction, or I guess in Australia that's less of that? Maybe we can share a little bit on the views on our encounter. Maybe Chintan can go first.
Okay. I think to begin with, we got to realize that public spaces are the places to build trust and togetherness within the communities. So this pandemic definitely took that away from all of us for a certain extent. But the remarkable thing about Singapore, and sorry, I can only talk because about Singapore at this point in time, we are here. So great, Silvia, if you give us your Australian experience as well, or Brisbane experience, because I think Australia has very, very different experience right now from Melbourne to wherever. But here what has happened is that there is a certain level of trust in the system, which means that as soon as the government put some restrictions allowed for us to come out in phase 2, but we all adhered to the requirements of safe distancing, wearing a mask, etc., that allowed people to be out there again, that allowed people to very confidently take public transport, that allowed people to be in the parks, etc. And you could see the East Coast Park being again coming back to life, and people being overall broadly have managed that respect for what the law and order required us to do. And that has been really, really good. As you can see, families coming out, the older generation taking a few steps and coming out and not feeling scared about it, which is extremely important, because right now, again, what the stats have said is that more than the COVID, what's coming up next is the mental issues because of people being locked down for a long time, especially for the elderly. And how do we manage that? So I think what is really nice is that I've seen that change slowly with the phase 2 happening, and hopefully soon enough phase 3 in Singapore, and people being able to be trusting to government and being able to come out and use the public spaces and bring that community back together. And one thing is the physicality of these spaces. The other thing is the social and the emotional aspect of it, because this also creates a more social resilience within the fabric, and the governments manage that messaging really well as well. So I think overall, I think that's what I have seen, and I think it's been great how we've been able to use our outdoor spaces to bring people back and trusting.
Thanks, Chintan. I mean, my own experience is during the circuit breaker, everything was closed and only the park connector was open. So I stay near the park connector, and that was the only space I could use for my recreation activities, jogging and walking. And the park connector, because it's the only space that's open, it was really crowded. It was like Orchard Road in the weekend, you know. So I had to then resort to running or doing my jogs at the sidewalk And it was okay because there was less traffic and the air was good. So yeah, that was what I experienced. So I really appreciate the fact that when phase 2 and where we are at now, more spaces are being opened, and there's more places to go. Yeah. Silvia, what's your experience?
Yeah, no, I think it's similar in many senses. I think public spaces and open spaces, particularly green spaces, have been the safest places for us to be. Here in Australia, we do have most of the neighborhoods are very green, and we do have quite a lot of a very good infrastructure in that regard. I think what was interesting here was that at the beginning, it was almost like the lockdown came in stages as well. Like it didn't come in the way like, oh, we are having an outbreak, let's stop everything. So of course, like businesses, and they all sort of closed at the same time. But one thing that happened was that, for example, gyms and places like that weren't allowed to be open. So people were gathering in groups in parks and exercising in parks. And then as the numbers weren't going down, then even that was sort of, stopped being allowed for a while. And then we could still go out and exercise and go for runs and for walks and use public spaces, but just within our own cluster and home, not actually to engage with people that weren't from there. But I think what we noticed here as well is that even going for runs, the infrastructure is there, the paths are there, but we know that we need to keep a 1.5 meter distance apart. And that's when we are sort of like not actually exercising. Exercising is sort of like, you breathe more heavily, sometimes we were walking and someone walked past and you could feel that, and I was like, oh, I wish the footpath was wider and we could keep a safer distance. So those are things that we wouldn't think normally, but if you were sitting in a park, then you can choose to be far away. You can choose to have your arrangement. But if you are exercising in a path, then you were sort of limited to that space. So that's one thing that became clear, that I think, we just take for, that's fine and enough. In normal situations, it's enough for us to move. But when you are trying to get a little bit further away, then it would be more convenient to have more space.
The funny anecdote is that when I would go running, and if I would come very close to someone else, I would stop breathing. But then I learned that doesn't help.
Because you're breathing more later.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, thank you. That comes to our next question. Let's talk a little bit more on public space. Silvia has already started. So one of the key effects of the pandemic is social distancing. Silvia has mentioned the paths are too narrow. What do you do? But people will continue to need physical interaction, and this interaction will only be partially substituted by digital means. So public spaces are still important for this interaction, and public spaces traditionally are communal spaces that are designed to be inclusive and to encourage social interaction. So in this climate, are public spaces still relevant? If so, what roles do they play, and do they have to be designed differently? So I think one of the poll answer to have more innovation to drive movement of people. How does that come into play? Maybe, I don't know, Silvia, you would like to go first?
Yeah. So I'll first go to your first question. Are public spaces still relevant? I think they are more relevant than ever because that's one of the things that, nothing is 100% sure yet, but that's one of the things that we have seen, and is that COVID seems to be less spread out, or not less contagious, but we seem to be safer when we are in open spaces. So yes, they are more relevant than ever. I do think that there are ways that we can design public spaces that they still function as public spaces and as gathering spaces when we can gather, but that they are arranged in a way that we can keep the safe distance when needed. So one thing that I can bring up is that I've been doing a research that was in 3 stages, and the first stage was to identify, as I said before, what stopped during COVID. And then we identified some similarities, which sounds really strange because, and I first thought there's no similarities between a pandemic and an earthquake. But when we looked at the things that stopped functioning in relation to public spaces in the pandemic situation were very similar to the things that stopped or ceased to exist in a post-earthquake environment, like the one I was present for in Christchurch in 2011. So we looked into what were the things that happened in Christchurch at the time to bring the life back to the city. And of course, they didn't have a city. There was no other option, in that regard. I think we talk about COVID as a fast disaster in comparison to climate change. But when we think about it, if you compare COVID to an earthquake, it's really a slow disaster that we have an option. We can decide not to act and not to change. And there might be that, more, of course, we are all looking forward to go back to our lives pre-COVID. So there is a risk that nothing will change. But one thing that came out of that comparison to Christchurch was the way the landscape was arranged and the way the landscape was used to guide movement and even to increase the sense of density without being in a dense space, dense by people, dense by other things, by vegetation and other elements that can guide that urban space. So in that regard, there's also a space for technology. If we think about we don't want to be touching things. So is there a way of designing rubbish bins or water fountains in a way that we don't have to touch them, that they function without touch, they are sensing in that regard? Or are there ways that we could control the numbers of people, like count the numbers of people without having to physically count, that there's some sort of technology that helps us to control that density? Now, not only for public spaces, of course, that could be used for a lot of different things, but those are all things that we can consider. I think we always, we talk technology, and yeah, there are tracing apps and contact apps and all that, and those are really important as well, but those are not the only ways we can use technology. We can use technology in other ways to keep the distance, in the sense of keeping the densities and the numbers low, and in the sense of not having to necessarily physically interact with urban elements and urban furniture for that regard. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Silvia. Yeah, we do have, we use technology in our parks. We have this Safe Distance at Park app. I think it's called Safe Distance at Park, where it basically tells you real time whether the park is crowded or it's okay. So people are informed, make informed decisions whether they go to the park for their recreational exercises and so on. So yeah, I think technology plays a quite important part in public spaces. Chintan, do you have something you want to add on?
Yeah, I think the question where you asked, do they need to be designed differently? Mm-hmm. I probably not. I don't think public spaces need to be designed differently. Probably what we need to do is design a lot more of them. What is interesting is that in every other city in the world, people have realized this consciousness of how much open space should be given to people per capita, which is great because the number has gone up, the percentage, same as the number of ICU beds in the country. So you can see both medical and public, in a way, health. And health includes the medical health as well as the other health in terms of being outdoors and being less obese and etc. So I think overall, I think that's been great this has helped us to push that. The other important thing is cities are normally known, the identity of cities are normally known by the active community life. If you think about, even if you go on Lonely Planet or whatever, it'll first tell you about how vibrant the city is and the food places and the hawker centers and etc. for different cities, etc. And these are more important than the architectural artifacts that exist in the cities, because this vibrancy is of the community. And this is what becomes the attractor for most cities in the world, of why people would move there, why people would want to work there, etc. And these are important. So we need to do everything that we can to get people out in the city and be there, the residents, the elderly, the young, the children, etc., to be out there, to be able to experience that. Because, they say that to change people's habits, you need 21 days. we've had more than 7 months to change people's habits, which means that we should be able to reach to the point where we can use tactical urbanism to push for people to be more outdoors, cycle more, shop on streets other than malls because outdoors is safer, etc. And we can create these opportunities where we can give streets back to the people rather than to cars. And I know UR is very strongly advocating for that. LTA's tagline is all about that. And I think we need to really push that people actually get out there and be more physical in life to be out there. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we can talk a little bit on, do you see a trend of having more pedestrianized streets with more spaces for walking and cycling? But let's go to our second poll question in the meantime. So while we wait for some a response to this question, I would like to talk about a little bit on the software aspects of public space. I read in some cities like city of Charlotte in North Carolina, as part of placemaking, they have invited art into the public realm. The aim is to create attractive public realm, making it vibrant and enjoyable, to lift people's spirits up in this depressing time. I guess it helps with the mental and the physical health that's listed here in the poll question. So my question is, does placemaking in public space under the current situation, is it advisable or important? Is it a little bit contradictory contradictory with this social distancing? In URA, we have a public space program in which we support the community in activating public spaces through events or installations. So I guess events is a bit tricky now, but installations such as art, mural painting, they do activate the space, they do attract people to come and look at them. So how do we calibrate between adding delight to a public space and social distancing? Would you like to share what you experience in your city, Silvia? And yeah, Chintan, you might want to give your comments on this.
Yeah, I'm sure. I think, you know, my view of the word placemaking in the broader sense of the term, of not the long-term creating places, which is what Chintan was saying, which is, of course, we design for social cohesion, we design for people to come together. That's the main driver, is to encourage and to increase this sort of social belonging and sense of belonging that people have with places. But we are in a situation where we need places that are adaptable and that they can come back to this situation of bringing people together. But if we face another pandemic, and if we talk to epidemiologists, the other day I was talking to an epidemiologist and she said, it's not if, we will, you know, this will happen again. And so we need public spaces that are adaptable and that can respond to that. And in my view, this is a big role of placemaking and tactical urbanism and all these tools that we have that can be ephemeral, but they can test solutions. So placemaking in the sense of activating place in the longer term, just based on events, depends on how the events are run anyway. See, if there's no change to the place, or if there's no creation of attachment with place, when the event is gone, the place is gone, right? We need to use this connection and this hook that the event creates to then create other attractions to place that will linger, that will stay for longer. And I think this is the key role here, is that yes, people are cycling more and people are walking more because they are living in their own neighborhoods, and their neighborhoods are smaller, like they are the distances are shorter by nature. And because we don't have to travel to work, we have more time to commute within the neighborhood as well. So yes, I think that is a big change. I think there is going to be a big change in terms of, or I don't know if a big change, but there's some changes that people will be more resistant to use public transportation for a little while if there's no changes on how it operates. And so yes, you know, the mobility will probably change in some ways. Of course, I'm talking from an Australian perspective, that we live in a very spread out environment. You know, in the Sunshine Coast, we are really a lot of little towns along the coast. And so, yeah, they are far away from each other. It's not possible to cycle from one to another. You know, it's just not possible. It's not like we are in one city. It's multiple centers. So yeah, it's a very different context from an urban environment where you have the density and you have the critical mass to support public transportation that functions as well. You know, that you can afford maybe even having less people in the buses at any point in time because they can still come frequently and they will still attend enough people. It's a different scenario here, I guess.
Yeah, that is absolutely interesting. I think
we are talking from very different perspectives here when we talk about Australia and Singapore.
Yeah, I think that the interesting part about placemaking and public space is quite intricate, because placemaking is all about creating a place where people want to just be. That's how you make the place, and that to be has been changing, because previously placemaking, even in Singapore, when we think about placemaking, it was always about a big event at the Marina Bay area, or a night run, or the F1 race, and then hence creating a place for some time, etc. But because of this more neighborhoody thing, you can start seeing that the placemaking has to be looked at all scales, at neighborhood scale. So right now we've been looking at designing towns in Singapore which are 5-minute neighborhood towns and 10-minute neighborhood towns, which means you can walk to a smaller square for your neighborhood meeting. And then, because all of these placemaking aspects are identity of its own, you create a neighborhood identity, you create a town identity, and you create a city identity. And the placemaking on all three are at very different levels. The city identity in Singapore is all about bringing everyone together as one identity. We are here together to pull together and go through this difficult times. Whereas neighborhood is all about being there for each other and supporting and knowing each other, creating social resilience. So I see that now there is a lot more focus on that neighborhood aspect of placemaking, and we will get to the city aspect of placemaking later, when we can actually open up a lot more of our borders and talk about identity then. So it's been quite interesting, the scale changing at this point in time.
I love the way you talk this more neighborhoody things. Like we are creating a term here for the future.
Yeah.
the way we place making during COVID is neighborhoody based.
Okay, thank you. So maybe we bring up the results for the second poll question. Thank you. Oh, okay, that's it. Okay. So maybe I just go on to talk about mobility. So we have already started talking about urban mobility, and I think for me, I definitely have changed my travel patterns, and my children has changed their travel patterns. I'm now their personal chauffeur, back into school. So yeah, it has been busy trying to go in between meetings to pick them and send them. But anyway, on the point of mobility, during this period, the way we work has changed from physically being in the office to telecommuting. And more people are also relying on facilities in their neighborhood for grocery and daily amenities. And then people are using online e-commerce platforms and delivery services. So this results in the change of mobility pattern of people. How does this change impact the urban design and planning, and vice versa? We talk about converting roads to public space. Are there opportunity arising from this shift in the pattern? Maybe you can hear from Chintan first.
Yeah, I mean, there are quite a few that we've been looking at even before COVID. So just as an anecdote, we've designed a tool called measuring walkability. So we are now able to measure walkability in master plans or towns based on qualitative and quantitative data. So the difference is it a safe street to walk? And you can measure by the data that you can get from the city government on amount of thefts or stuff like that. Do I feel safe to walk? And that's a very different parameter. So the qualitative and quantitative, and we have created this whole tool with which we're able to measure walkability. And this conversation started pre-COVID, and it's amazing how the tool has had to rejig itself since the pandemic has hit in this conversation. Because the whole interesting aspect is about reimagining the streets? How can we create more, give streets back to the people, to make more streets, less roads, create more possibilities of hence creating safer cities? We've been also discussing with, for example, the Land Transport Authority, that we could think about dynamic streets where certain times of the day there is less traffic, and currently already there is. Can we actually dynamically move streets in and out depending on the requirements of the shops and restaurants inside? Which means in the morning time it is a street for buses, and the evening it becomes streets for people to come out and be out there in the open, and hence increase capacity, but also create more safety, because as we always have said, outdoors people are safer than indoors. So how do you change those behaviors as well? So I think it's all of that coming together in this conversation about what does that mobility, walkability, placemaking, safety, child-friendly cities, all of those things can come together to be able to get us to in the right direction. So I think there's been a lot of discussions already happening, but I'm hoping that some of them we can action it, especially in cities like Singapore, where we have an amazing public transport system. We have great control over private cars. So how can we turn that around? And eventually, Tracey, we can have kids going back to school in public transport systems, and we can actually be more out there using the tarmac for people to walk and cycle than for cars. So, yeah.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Silvia.
Yeah, I think again the situation is a bit different here, but in one thing that, yes, you talked about the 5-minute neighborhood. Like here in Australia, in Melbourne, we're talking about the 20-minute neighborhood, which is a little bit more spread out, but it's still doable within that time frame and within the sort of type of urban morphology and the form of the cities that we have. But one thing that is interesting to see is that in a context where we are living more in our own neighborhoods, in some places here, and when I live it was very clear during the semi-lockdown that we had, was that people weren't traveling so much between neighborhoods as well. And so you had much more like parking space that was unnecessary, because within your own neighborhood, you can cycle and you can walk. But then you have those wide streets where you have parking on both sides. And if people are not coming in and out, then you don't need that many. You don't need so much space actually dedicated to cars, or cars that are parked, that not doing anything more than that. So yeah, in that regard, that was a change, because then again, you come to realize how much dominated by cars the urban environment is when the cars are not there, because it feels empty. It just feels very much more open than normal. So that was one thing. And the other thing that is really interesting is that in this study that I have been doing, one key thing that we have been looking at is this idea of safety. And it's interesting that you brought up, Chintan, from the perspective of traffic and transportation and being safe for children and all that. Because when we looked at the model, we are approaching the urban design post-pandemic from a perspective of complex systems. So dealing with the city as a complex systems with multiple values and functions and things that make the city function in a proper way, including biodiversity and ecology and everything that is not built and that cohabit that space. But one thing that we noticed was that we approach safety from a harm sort of approach, right? It's the car that could hit me, or that could hit my child, or it's the curb that I could trip and fall. But we don't deal with, in our previous model, which was a model of public space of Queensland here in Australia, we actually didn't look at public space from an invisible threat type of approach, right? We looked at how to design public spaces in a safe way based on physical safety in that regard, of the safety that we know we can be hurt, not from a thing of like, how can I use this space without touching and without connecting and without being too close to build surfaces that could be contaminated. So when we looked at the model in a COVID or in a pandemic situation, we realized that there are lots of other types of dangers and harms and safety levels that you need to consider and obviously the idea is not that if there's an extreme case of an outbreak and you need a full lockdown, we need a full lockdown. We can't use the public spaces. But the idea is that if the spaces are properly designed and adaptable, then they can support this mental health that we asked in the poll. And, you can support this social cohesion in a much earlier stage of the lockdown, or, that we could bit by bit, slowly bring back some of these spaces that perform safer in a pandemic situation, if we were considering all those other layers of safety that we didn't previously consider because it just wasn't there. It wasn't something that we were looking at. So it just changes the way we look at the problem, in the sense of, how do we design something that you need to be there, and for mental health, and for the sense of belonging, and for knowing that I belong to this community, and that I'm still important, and I'm still part of something. You need to be able to get out, and you need to be able to see your neighbors even from far away and say, hi, I'm still here. That's what keeps people better in that regard. And that's something that I think urban design does have a role on playing, on bringing in this adaptability when needed. And it might be that in a lower environment with more green spaces, it's easier. Density does play a role on the adaptability, I guess, but I think it's possible in every context. There's also, in Singapore is a very good example, there are all these discussions in the research community about density. Is density more dangerous? There isn't a clear evidence that there is.
Actually, if I could add to that, sorry, Tracey, if I may. And there was a question, and there are really cool questions, by the way, in the chat. But there's one question about, is density an issue? And exactly taking from what you highlighted, Silvia, especially in the pandemic. Density is good, even now. I mean, we've proved that in Singapore. We've actually looked at just purely forget the infections, but in terms of death rates, we managed it really well. So if you have good governance, you can manage that. And it's eventually, when you look at the other big curve, and again, there was a nice question somewhere up there around climate change, etc. And our responsibility in this world in terms of managing the carbon footprint. Density is important also to allow that to reduce the carbon footprint, but to create more spaces outside. So again, when I was talking about the 5-minute, 10-minute cities, to all the urban designers listening to this, we've actually come up with a unit where if you do a 50-hectare community or neighborhood with the right amount of density, you can create a really nice 5-minute neighborhood and a Singapore density. And you need 200 hectares for the 10 minutes thing. So we've gone down to that level of detail and been able to plan how mobility and how cycling and pedestrian and safer child-friendly neighborhoods can be formed. And for that to happen, for these 5 or 10-minute cities to happen, you need to have a certain level of density to make that happen. And I think in Singapore, we're on the right track, because I think that's what it's going to let us be where we want to be.
Yeah.
But even access, sorry, Tracey.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say access to hospitals, to doctors, to, the more spread out you are, or the further people are in the rural environment, less access you have to support. You might be less exposed, but in a real outbreak, you are still exposed when you need to be with other people, and you might have less support. So yeah, and I was just going to add, the balconies in Italy, I think are a great example of how even density can support mental health in that regard, that you can still connect but not be inside of other people's places, so there's all that sort of environment that density promotes as well.
Well, thank you. I guess in Singapore, density is not an option. We are so small, we need to go high density. So we really need to think of how to adopt very careful and comprehensive safe management measures, like your safety distancing at high traffic locations, and to wear masks all the time. So that's how we deal with it. And hopefully, keep fingers crossed, so far so good. The numbers have been good. Okay, I've been prompted to open the floor for questions. So there are some interesting questions here that has been sent to me. Okay, maybe we start with something simple. I think it's simple. Where is it? Okay, question for Silvia. During your introduction, you mentioned the term semi-public spaces. Could you give some examples?
Yeah, so when I was talking about semi-private, I was talking about, for example, cafes that use public space, you know, that they will put the tables outside. Sometimes here, and I know different places have, you know, I've spent some time in Europe, and in Europe around squares, they will just bring the tables out to the square. That's a completely public space just used by that. By those establishments. But here in Australia, what tends to happen in many places is that the private spaces like the cafes will actually put the tables on the footpath. So the footpaths are very wide. Let's say half of the footpath is taken with tables, and then other half is actually destined to people to walk. So is that sort of gradation, if you like, from coming from something that is completely public, which is the footpath, into something that is public but privately managed, and then into the cafe that is fully private. And I think that's that's where we have probably the most space for adapting as well. You know, places like some areas in Canada, I think Toronto was the first one that has a changed policy to allow the cafes to spread themselves out using the footpath so they could open and have more people during the pandemic. Now, do you want that always? Probably not, you know, because that is encroaching into the public spaces that is necessary for walkability and for all other things. But it's good that there is that flexibility if needed. And that's sort of like what I was trying to mention, is that you go from something that is very private, that is the cafe itself, to something that is semi-private, semi-public, to something that is very public. So is that the capacity of enlarging that semi-public is really important. And here in Australia, we are seeing, you know, there are lots of little cafes and restaurants that are small, that they enclose the space is very small, and they don't even have tables at the moment. They are all just outside. So if the outdoors space or semi-private space is too small, then they can't afford opening, because they can't have enough people. So just for takeaways or something like that. So it's that idea of flexibility using that space.
Thank you. Hope it answered the question. So, and another question, I think probably for Chintan, how will Singapore's current urban planning landscape change, be modified in light of the rise of 15-minute cities, especially since some areas of Singapore are planned in clusters?
I think it's not going to change. We are moving in the direction of achieving that. And Tracey, you highlighted the whole idea around we are looking at polycentric aspect of Singapore, which is absolutely going along those directions around woodlands, or looking at Punggol on the right, and then of course the areas going to Jurong on the left, and we have the secondary centers as well coming in, and they are already moving towards that aspect of the 15-minute city. And I think COVID has already highlighted that at how certain businesses within the neighborhoods have flourished, whereas businesses which were dependent on people like us who used to go to the office in the CBD areas have actually gone down. And so we overall need to look at the whole mechanism together. There was a question as well in the chat group where are CBDs not going to exist anymore? They are not important anymore. They absolutely are important. We do need CBDs to be there because they do form the identity of our cities. If you just Google Singapore or Sydney or Brisbane, etc., and you go to click on images, and the entire page that you see, the photograph is mainly going to be of areas which are in the city centers of all these cities. They create that identity and sense of pride. So we need to look at all of those in terms of 15-minute cities and how do we achieve that. And of course, the mobility will be the most important thing to achieve that. And Silvia, you touched upon that. In 15 minutes, can I get to my doctor? In 15 minutes, can I get to a 7-Eleven? In 15 minutes, can I get to my kid's school by walking or cycling? And those things will change the way we plan a mixed-use development. 15 minutes, can I get to my work? And that will be the perfect thing that we can all do that.
Thank you.
That's it. Can I just add one thing to that? It's
Sure.
really interesting because we have had, you know, I moved to the Sunshine Coast here in Australia, in Queensland in January. And before that, I was in Cairns, which is on the doorstep of the Great Barrier Reef in the northeast of the country. And it's a small city for international standards, I guess. Australia is a medium-sized city, but it's around 150,000. And there was a discussion there at the time.
It's a very small city.
Yeah, that's right. You compare. I'm originally from Brazil. If you compare to Brazil, it's a town, but it's there was a discussion because there's many places here in Australia. You know, we talk about CBDs as if CBDs were central cities. CBDs are central business districts, and we are trying to turn them into central cities that function like the old central cities with mixed use, with people living and all that. But, you know, lots of places in the CBD don't even have schools. So we talk about having mixed use, but how can I live in the CBD with my family if there's no school in that radius? And that's actually the center of the city. But there was this discussion about, do we even want a CBD? I have to say, I was really shocked when I heard that. I was like, is that something that is questionable? And you know, I think it's a fair question when you are used to an environment that the CBD is not a functioning place. You know, and there are many small towns or other cities that, after 5 p.m. it's empty because there's no one living. So there's no, you know, as you very well said, Chintan, the business there support the people working, not the people living, right? And so it's a different environment. And then we had this discussion of, no, hang on, where is the only place in the city that everyone at some point goes? It doesn't matter where I live. At some point, I'll have to do something in the CBD. I'll have to go to the center. And so that is the identity, because everyone will identify with the CBD, because that's a place, that's your second, it's almost like a third place, right? It's your home, it's your work, and it's your central city. That's the place that you go to. And so that was really, I found really interesting. And of course, there are cities that don't have very clear CBDs. Here in Queensland, we have both Brisbane in the middle, of course, the capital, and Brisbane is a big city and has its own CBD, you know. But the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast, one in the north and one in the south, they are both coasts. So they are both little towns along the coast. The Gold Coast is more urbanized now, but it's still, when we look, there isn't a clear center, you know, so that there has been a lot of effort and it is becoming clear, but it's quite different. It's very, but yeah, I don't think it's questionable. I think that's where, for mental health and identity and all that, you know, like, why do you care about the city? That is really fundamental.
Okay, thank you. I'll go on to the questions. There's quite a few questions. There is a recent article about having pedestrian etiquette on pavement shared with cyclists. Given the constant clash between pedestrians, cyclists, PMD users, should there be segregated bike lanes or bike lanes on public roads to reduce the conflict of pavement space? And a related question, Singapore has the lowest mode share for walking and perhaps cycling compared to some other cities, which is even more challenging given that COVID may discourage unnecessary health exposure. Okay, that depends on which part of the COVID period we're talking about. How can we improve and innovate to encourage more walking? And I'm interested to know cycling as well, because in Singapore, the weather is hot too, right? Yeah, so somebody, Chintan, you want to respond to that?
How do you encourage walking and cycling? I think it's about creating a place that you enjoy walking in. So I'll give an example, and I'm sorry for people who live in that area, because I'm going to give my first experience of one area where I went to, and then the area where I work. So where I work, it is Tanjong Pagar, and I consider that as one of the most ideal city center formula. It's got public housing, it's got private housing, it's got restaurants, bars, cafes, it's got office spaces, it's got community spaces. It's got a really nice mix, and hence you always see the vibrancy throughout the day, and it works like a really nice community. So Tanjong Pagar is a great example, and where I work right now is very close to that, next to the URA office actually, Fraser Towers, and we have this Amoy Street. Now, I have walked from, and sorry, Silvia, you may not get the scale, but I walked from Tanjapagara station all the way to the edge of Amoy Street, and which is approximately a kilometer. Let's take it that way. And you don't feel that kilometer. So you remember when I talked about walkability tool that we've built, it is about qualitative and quantitative, the feeling of distance. You don't feel the distance because there's constantly change of diversity in the building typologies, the streets that you walk through, the green spaces, the activity at the ground floor, etc. makes it very easy to walk that kilometer or even cycle in Tanjapagara. And I cycle to work every day. And Tracey, you're right, in terms of temperature, I cycle to work every day. It's because I know that at the end of the day at my office, I have showers and I can shower, leave my bike and go upstairs, come downstairs, take the bike, come home, and of course I have showers. Lucky enough in this house. So it works. And then when I came here, which is 5.5 years back, in the first 2 months, I went to Punggol and I went to the central station, and I walked on that main road, and that feeling. And once you reach the water channel, canals, it's beautiful, the river, because then you can just keep walking. But my walk from there to Punggol, that water was on the main road. And that experience of that kilometer was very different than the experience within Tanjapagara. Now, of course, Punggol's gone a long way in the last 5.5 years, and there's a lot of changes that have happened. But what can we do now where we can give some of those road spaces, a 6-lane road, some of it back to creating streets out of those? So just as an example of how we can create more cycle and walkable places, you got to make that feeling of safety and vibrancy so that people can actually would like to be in those spaces. We like to go to the PCNs. We like to walk around the canals, especially the ones which are naturalized. So Ulu Pandan, or example, those canals which are now being naturalized, they're beautiful to go there, and you cycle, and families and kids are cycling and walking, but you don't see that happening on Keppel Highway. People don't walk there, even though there are pavements there. So how do you create more of those opportunities?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. That you know, for the urban designers that are present, you know about Ian Gale, and for the non-urban designers, Ian Gale is a Danish architect, and Gale is all about designing for people and cities for people. And he says something that I find really interesting, which is we human beings, we are social beings who need to be entertained, and entertainment in an urban environment means something changes or a surprise, as he puts, every 4 to 5 seconds. Now, when we say that, it's like, wow, you need to design something that is really, you know, but it's not. Like in an urban environment, a surprise could be someone coming out of a shop, or could be a corner you can turn, or could be anything, a building that is different. So it's just keeping that change and keeping that pace in a way that there's enough attraction, I guess. And also there's a difference in the frame of mind of, yes, I can take a walk, or you know, the useful walk, and the walk that you don't feel, that you just, it's easier and more pleasant to actually walk than to jump in the car and be there quickly, just because it is a nice thing to do and it's a nice environment that you like to be in. And I think that's something that we need to really aim for as urban designers and urbanists, and which is not, our work is not only about the destinations, it's not only about creating fast routes and efficiency, it's about creating experiences as well, and that those experiences are really what are going to support the active mobility and yeah, all the other things that we need for climate change and to reduce carbon emissions and all that. It's a, you know, I think in the first impression might be beauty and vibrancy have nothing to do with climate change. Yes, it has everything to do, because that's what actually makes people decide not to be in the car and to be part of that neighborhood in a different way. And I think, you know, this idea of, oh yeah, no, it's not too far. It's only 2 kilometers. You can walk 2 kilometers. And yes, you can, but you won't. You will if it's really interesting, if you have the time, and, you know, if you have a shower in each end, and you can, and all those things. But you can have cities that are the 5-10 minute walks, where in that radius you can do all the key things, and that those things actually happen in a pleasant way. Yeah.
Thanks, Silvia and Chintan. Okay, there is two questions which I think are quite related. Are there any quantitative or qualitative data on the impact of social distancing on placemaking? And how do you measure the qualitative aspect of you don't feel a distance, or probably the qualitative aspect of social distancing, I assume? Do you get the question?
Yeah, I saw the comment, and I think it's based on the thing I highlighted around the qualitative part of how do you measure the feeling?
Yeah.
How do you measure qualitative aspects?
Mm.
Now you can't measure other than by asking people. So giving an example of the tool, we have quantitative and qualitative aspects within the wheel, the walkability wheel that we've designed, and we have certain things where we can directly take data straight from the open source data. So how safe is a place, how easy it is to walk. We have down to the data of certain streets we've done 5 cities and 5 areas in different 5 cities, Singapore being one of them. And we looked at the amount of trees being planted, the width of the pavement, the areas where the pavement's covered. All of those become part of the quantitative discussion of the aspect of walking. But then in the end, when the feeling aspect comes, it's a qualitative thing where you actually have a way of asking people and then they respond to that. Whether do they feel like they walked a kilometer? It's a simple question. And they feel like, no, I thought I just walked 5 minutes, but actually they had walked 10 minutes, but they didn't realize it. So you can create that in terms of how you design your streets. The day we all take a call and an oath that we will from now onwards only design streets and not roads, I think the world will be a better place to live in.
Yeah. Okay, we do have a question here. Maybe we can relate it back to the public spaces that is provided for this users. Now, how do you consider social integration between the challenge of aging population and family care responsibility? Lessons in the Netherlands where facilities may be provided where old folks can interact with kindergarten children or even university housing. I suppose it's talking about how the facilities can be provided to have this integration. Is it in the form of public spaces or in the form of amenities? Yeah.
I think there are some things that are sort of habits and cultural norms and things like that you know, it's sometimes the population wants to come together, but there are some sort of spaces that can be created in the public realm that are very much destined to a certain population. We were talking the other day in a class here, we were talking about who uses, for example, skate parks. Right, there's nothing against the skate parks, and I think I have one very close, and but it's very focused on one section of the population. So they can still be there, and that's absolutely fine. But that's not the type of space that's going to bring communities together in that sort of different layers. One thing that I've seen, for example, and this is just one of the many possible examples, we organized in Cairns and in Townsville here in Queensland a couple of years ago an Urban Thinkers Campus. So the Urban Thinkers Campus is a United Nations event that is the way of trying to implement the new urban agenda at a local level, understanding the needs of that specific local level. And the focus of that event was to bring the community together to discuss health and how the public space impacts on health. So we looked at things like active lifestyles and active mobility. We looked at social inclusion, and we looked at healthy eating. So access to foods, to food that is actually healthier than fast food, that you would or make healthy foods fast food in some ways, you know, but make it faster, make it easier and accessible. But one thing that we discussed very strongly was how can we use spaces of inclusion for health eating, for example. So for example, could we have a community garden where different groups come together to to plant and to implement and to maintain that. But also when you harvest, then you can have different sections of the population coming and teaching each other on how to do things that are locally based and you know, and bring the community together in that way. So there are complete different types of public spaces that are focused on integrating, and there are others that are focused on like specific populations, and there is a space for both, but we do need to make sure that we add inclusive spaces as well, and that they are frequent and they are accessible. So yeah, so those are examples that were experiences that were very clear here, and that came from the community as well. When we asked how do we include, those were all ideas that came from the people involved on those events.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, sorry, the point of Netherlands, I used to live in Holland before I moved to the UK. Probably that's where I got my biking habit in. And I'm talking about years back, when even then the whole interesting idea of bringing the elderly with the children was worked really, really well, because they were basically ticking the boxes for both. So the elderly care and the child care were kind of brought closer together. And then you do activities together, which kind of allowed for elderly to not feel lonely and the children feeling safe in a certain way. So I think that kind of has worked. And in a way, when we are now thinking about designing cities, especially in aging communities, we really are thinking about these things of these two extreme age groups, both vulnerable. We talk about child-friendly cities, we talk about aging cities, we talk about that almost in the same breath. So how do you actually can work out our designs of cities, which are quite similar in terms of absolutely thinking of planning requirements for both these age groups, of how you design a city which is child-friendly, which automatically becomes safer for aging population as well. So how do you decide where the bus stop is as soon as you come out of your house, how close it is, what's the closest school or what's the closest area to go and sit on a park bench? All of those things have become quite an interesting part of designing our cities. But it's also around really thinking how we bring this aspect in a basic plan. So when we are designing all our cities, we think in a very different way. Our walkable time is 4 minutes or 5 minutes to an X amount of kilometers, but probably that we shouldn't do that anymore. Our designing should be now based on a different denominator rather than the usual non-disabled people. So how do you bring those characters as well in our conversation becomes important. I just yesterday gave a talk on food, urban food in cities, and we are doing a big research on that. And there were two things came out. One is the food production, which has to happen in a very different way. But the whole aspect around food and communities, even in Singapore is looking at it in terms of the rooftop food production or in allotments, etc. The main byproduct is actually community bonding and getting aging population and children closer together rather than the production of food. Production of food is a by the way, great that food is also happening, but it's more about getting communities together. So it's really interesting what it becomes your primary output, what you want from these actions.
Yeah. Yeah, there was quite a lot of research and a very interesting outcome in Christchurch post-earthquake with the community gardens, exactly for that reason. There's a layer of resilience for access to food, but there's also this idea of being a safe, natural place where people can come together in small groups without saying, let's go and get together. No, yeah, they're doing something for the community and socializing in that way as well. So it was a very important dimension of resilience in that environment.
Thank you. Okay, we have this question. I think it's more related to Singapore. It says, I'd like to ask a question about commercial spaces being introduced into the heartland areas. An example will be the future Punggol Digital District. As great as it sounds, for those who live in Punggol who aren't in the digital industry, how will they benefit? As for those who live in Punggol and are in the digital industry, it seems like the companies have the final say of where their offices are. So what are our comments, and how do we head in the direction, I suppose, in the direction of polycentric kind of planning? Chintan, you have anything to say to this?
Yes, I do, and quite a lot. But I'll keep it short. Uh, I think there is a lot to benefit from having a focused kind of industry within our heartlands. Whether you are in the digital industry or not, that doesn't matter. You're creating a level of employment within your neighborhoods, which is always beneficial. Same example that we talk about CBDs. As soon as you have work areas around you, or even a cool, interesting innovation manufacturing areas within your neighborhood, you automatically start having supporting uses around it. You then start having cafes or restaurants or schools or even daycare, because people who come there to work want to have kids being there around. You create the diversity and the safer place because of that thing. And that makes overall the neighborhood a lot more vibrant, safer, and mixed use. And so whether you are in the digital industry or not, this is the biggest problem that you see with cities in the United States, where you have dormitory towns where there is nothing around it, and then you have workplaces where you go downtown where you work, and then you go back in the night to dormitory towns. And that's been the biggest issue around the future of climate and how you manage carbon, or how do you manage your daily life, because you end up spending 2 hours of your time alone in a car going back and forth. So it's only the right thing to do to create these things. And because Singapore's small, it's easy to create these focused industries in different polycenters to be able to attract certain kind of industries. And always clustering creative class works really well. So you will see that if there is a Google there, you'll start seeing that maybe Facebook also opens close by, just as an example, because normally people of similar kinds want to be around similar things. And so clustering also works.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess it does work already in some ways, right? Because people who are living in Punggol and working in the digital district, they have already benefit from the short distance, between work and home, and they don't have to travel all the way to the CBD. So it has met the objective of allowing people to work near their home. Yeah. Okay. I think we can take one last question from the audience. What do you think are some questions and implications that we should keep in mind when designing Singapore's smart nation vision? I guess in light of this current situation, in particular on the emerging idea of smart citizenship. I'm not sure whether I can tie that question to then using, how do we then use technology in designing of public space and in keeping us safe. Yeah. Silvia?
I think it's a very, I don't know exactly the context of the Singapore question. So I don't know if you want to.
Yeah. I should ask Chintan to start first. So sorry about that, Chintan. Yeah.
I think in terms of smart nation, the first important thing would be, I don't know if you guys can hear me clearly. The important thing would be the privacy would be the utmost important thing in the smart nation program, because that allows people to trust the system and hence a willingness to use the tech or technology. Because if people would not trust it, there'll be less people who will subscribe to it, and then you get less results out of that. The track and trace app is a great example, right? The government keeps talking almost every other week to say we want more people to get into it, because only then, once we have more people in it, we can literally see how the city is breathing in terms of managing the virus. So we can all talk about how technology is helping us, and it has greatly helped us. This entire thing about track and trace and safe check-ins has really, really helped us to manage our city really well where we are right now. But that wouldn't have been possible if people didn't trust that system, or people didn't trust giving up, or people didn't have a trust in the government that I'm giving up all my issues. So it's so clearly linked to that personal freedom and the success of technology in placemaking or using spaces. And the other thing it has to be, and absolutely important, has to be universal access. So a good example is, whatever years back, I can't remember, I downloaded the Uber app for my mum, and it worked really well. She's like, oh, cool, I can see the cars, but she didn't know how to book. So in the end, I was in my office and calling an Uber for her where she was to pick her up from somewhere to get her somewhere, because she didn't know, she knew the app was cool, but she didn't know how to use it. So how do you make something that is much more easy and universal for people, especially in aging population, that only then it becomes truly we're working towards a universal smart nation.
Thank you. Silvia, do you have any comments on how do we design public space safely with technology?
Yeah, I think just going back to that, I was just going to say that that's very similar to actually what happened here in Australia with the tracing app. There was a big, you know, sort of like a big push for everyone to use, and that was a big concern as well, was privacy. And then we got to that point where everyone was discussing, you know, or everyone embarks on it, and then we can really trace and know what's going on, or it's only always going to be partially successful. So yeah, there's I think privacy is always and also it's culturally based in some ways. Depending on where you are, privacy means different things. So yeah, I think it's also understanding how far you can go in different places. Not all places can operate the same way. And yeah, in terms of technology, I think I've mentioned some things before. I think there is a way of, you know, we were talking about how to quantitatively and qualitatively analyze and investigate public spaces, and observing public spaces is a big thing as well. As if we want to know what is going on, you know, observing people, we can work out where they are going and how they are behaving and what they are avoiding. And talking to people, we can know how they feel. But the interesting thing is that not always people will, you know, if you ask them, why are you doing what you are doing? Their reasoning might not be exactly what is actually going on. You know, like we process the information in a way that's not necessarily how we behave sometimes. An example, I was doing a research some time ago and I asked someone, do you think this urban environment is good? Or what would you change? You know, like my early days of a researcher, like played urban designer here for me, like, how do you think this should be designed? And the first answer that I got was, I don't like this footpath because you know, here in Australia, the streets are very narrow and the footpaths are too narrow. And I'm like, there's a 3-meter footpath here. Like, this is definitely not too narrow. But and then we started talking, and really the reasoning wasn't that. It was because it wasn't covered and shaded. There was no attraction. It was boring. There was too many cars. And, you know, so I think sometimes observing is very, very rich, because people not necessarily say, you know, exactly what, like what would help us to design. And I think in that regard, also the technology can help to work out the patterns and the movement and dynamics of public space, to understand what has changed in this time and how people are behaving and what they are trying to avoid, or how they are making it safer for them. I think that's one aspect. The other aspect is this idea of passive interaction, of interacting with things without having to touch on them. So to have sensitive or sensing elements in the city that you don't necessarily have to touch. Those are very, I think in terms of COVID, looking at COVID, the numbers and the control of density. And also one other thing we have been discussing is the role of having access to internet, because depending again on the age groups we are talking about and who we want to attract to different places and what people could be doing in those spaces. If we want people to being that in certain areas and not necessarily be interacting and be there for you know, to enjoy the public space and to feel they are part of, like, if they are not interacting with their group, what are they doing? And so internet has sort of free Wi-Fi, and internet in hot points and hotspots will actually play a different role in placemaking, in attracting people and attracting different people to different places. So there are very different layers of operating the design and operating the elements that we can interact with, of counting and keeping the control of densities in terms of movement. It's not density in terms of living or residential or anything, or or built density. It's more density in the sense of how many people can access the spaces or being the spaces to keep safe. So I think there are things that we weren't necessarily thinking before. I know the sensing cities and sensing elements is something that has been around for a while, but not necessarily the counting the numbers and tracing movement and all that type of thing. And I think there will be a role on that as well in the future.
Yeah, and COVID-19 has definitely, catalyzed this whole digital transformation. And in fact, in our office, we use Skype Business, right? We just use it as a messaging tool. But all of a sudden, we're doing all this virtual meeting during this period. And it's amazing now that we can have Silvia with us, from all the way down under. So I think technology has done wonders actually in this period. Yeah. Question, and Chintan and Silvia, you can give your concluding statement if you wish to. Okay, so the last question is, some people say that human beings have short memory. Should one day things go back to normal or almost normal? Some of these lessons and changes can be forgotten. So what are your views on this? And which of these changes do you expect them to last? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I can talk to that. I think, I think we have been talking a lot about that, of, this collective amnesia that, which is normal, and we have our lifestyles and our cultures and our way of being, and we are all sort of wanting to go back to that. I think the risk is that what are the lessons we can learn? And the reason why in this specific study that we did, we compared the pandemic with the earthquake was because during the earthquake, you had no option to actually, go back to normal and go back to what was before, because there wasn't that option. So if we were to look at that and think about what could happen in the future again, how could we change? I think the key message is adaptability, is to be able to design public spaces that could adapt and that could change. And I think in tactical urbanism and placemaking, they have a key role on that, to pilot these changes and to test just these changes. Yeah, sometimes we think everything that involves public spaces is a big job. It's a big work, and it's expensive, and it will affect a lot of people. And sometimes it doesn't need to be. It could be something that starts small, that is tested. And if it works better than was working before, then it becomes something more permanent. And I think that's something that is really, really important. I also think that the role, and this is probably a little bit of, provocation from an urban design perspective. I think for us urban designers and planners, one of my students asked the other day, like, but how do I relate policy? I was teaching a course on theory and policy, and he was like, how do I relate all this theory to policy? And I was like, well, policy is everything. Policy basically frames everything that we can and we can't do. Everything is a result of policy, of urban policy. If that policy is not informed by theory, informed by how do we create spaces where people want to walk, or all those things that we learned over the years, how can we expect to actually create a space that's not that's going to function well? So I think we have to take all that into account. And yes, it's a big job, but planners and designers are here to develop these spaces so they perform in a safe way, and they adapt in a way that help them perform better if another pandemic or if another outbreak happens. So yeah, I think we can't let the amnesia take account, and people don't want to change their lifestyles, and that's absolutely fine. And sometimes the changes happen in the background, in a non-pandemic situation, we won't even notice. The life is still the same, but we just have that ability to adapt if needed. I think that's a key message.
If I could add then, I think what has happened is every time there's been a change or there's been a shock or a change in technology, cities have adapted. So for example, in the 60s, we had huge floor plates, we had big buildings because you didn't have computers. You had a lot more people working in an office doing the amount of job that we do now. And then when computers came in, and then when open plan offices came in, the buildings started getting smaller, which means plots sizes started reducing. You could have a lot more people packed in the CBD areas or anywhere for that matter. Technology allowed the taller buildings and etc. And all of that happened. Um, this is hopefully going to be something similar. The fact that if this is going to change the way we work for the rest of our lives as a lifestyle choice, that we decide to work partly from home, partly from office, that's going to fundamentally change the way we think about all our streets and our mobility patterns and designing our bus networks or cycling or walking, etc. But also how we think about future uses of our city spaces. And I'm hoping that these, as I said, every habit is for 21 days. After that becomes a habit. Um, I think some of these things we may not roll back, and we will think of it as a default thing to say that, if I've employed you, I'm not expecting to see you every day in my office because some days you're going to work from home. It's going to be a default choice. So I think those things will exist, and we will have to really, as policymakers, planners, designers, need to really step up very quickly to think about what is the future of our neighborhoods where we live, or our cities where we work, or this is where the call is, or the future is that it's all the same. So we'll see what the future mixed use future feels like and looks like.
Yeah, thank you, Sylvia and Chintan. I do agree with you. Well, today's challenge is COVID-19, right? The next time there could be different type of pandemic, different type of challenges. So I think the most important lesson from all these is that we have to make sure our plan is agile so that our cities can be resilient and adaptable. Yeah. Okay, it's been a wonderful discussion. I'd like to thank our two panelists, Sylvia and Chintan, for the insights that you have shared with us. I've definitely learned a lot. And to all our participants, thank you for your active involvement. May I pass the spotlight back to the MC.
Thank you, Tracey, Silvia, and Chintan for the very insightful conversations. As part of today's conversation, we have specially put together a resource guide. You can actually access it through the QR code. And the link that we are putting up is a slide, and as well in the chat box. And once again, thank you for your participation in this year's 4 conversations. We look forward to seeing you again next year. Stay safe and have a good night. Bye-bye.